All right, ring a ding ding. I need my next Saturday, 2 p.m. There'll be an email going out tomorrow with all the info. Norma Barzi.
Norma.
I need. Remember Ken Zabel used to have the bell that he rang to tell everybody to come to Adult Ed.
Okay, I got that one. Can I look at the
Oh
front?
yeah, this is great. The first Oregonians.
Okay, I'll have to look at that one. Look for that one.
This
Very
one's
good.
great, just like to read.
Yeah.
This one is more informational. I really enjoyed this one, just from getting the first-person perspective of what life is like. Particularly him talking about kind of like the transition between when he was living with his grandma, and then how he watched kind of the culture change over the course of time. It's really fascinating, right? Because he talks about going to a boarding school. And,
Yeah, what an interesting artifact of American history.
he had a fairly positive, I mean not positive, fairly neutral experience, but he definitely remembers he remembers the process of like when I started school I spoke this language, when I ended school I spoke this language and I had forgotten that language. It's really fascinating. Oh yeah. That'd be awesome, yeah. I will continue this after I get back. There's no rush, no. So the current timeline is today we're going to cover up through modern era for Grand Run. So we're going to talk about Termination Act up through what things are happening. Then my next thing is to widen the lens a little bit and just start talking about Native peoples all up and down the Washington, Oregon coast. Right? Because we've really kind of like lasered in this little area. I wanted to look at Puget Sound, and because there's a lot of fascinating differences and similarities between the experiences of these peoples. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I saw that. Yeah, about Doctrine of Discovery. Yeah. Oh, I'm going to talk about it today because we haven't really named it explicitly, but that is the theological, philosophical underpinnings of basically the entire American expansion, right? Oh. And it took what was that from 2018 to 16 to yeah, right. All right. Sorry. I'm ready to roll. Okay, so I just want to catch you up on where we're at and where we're going. So we've got class today and next week. Then I'm gone the 7th and the 14th, so obviously there won't be adult ed. But we do have some more to talk about with regards to this topic yet. So what I want to do when I get back is we've been pretty much laser focused on kind of Grand Ronde community. So when I get back, we're going to widen that lens a little bit and look at the rest of the rest of the peoples in Oregon, and we're not going to go nearly as in depth as we do with Grand Ronde. But I think it's worth looking at, like the Burns Paiute, the Klamath peoples, just so we get a sampling of what that looks like. And then we're also going to take a look at the Puget Sound area as well too, because I did a lot of reading incidentally into that, and I think there's some fascinating stories up there, especially talking about fishing rights, that we talked about. So there's some stories to look at there. Also, I just got done chatting with Susan. So Susan's son's father-in-law is of Native descent, as is Susan's daughter-in-law. So we're potentially going to have him come in and speak somewhat as well too. That's in the works. That'll be an up and coming thing sometime November, December. Yeah.
Have you ever read Kurt Nelson's
No, I haven't.
book?
I've read his blog. I haven't read his book yet.
Yeah. Treaties and Treasuries.
Okay. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. I've got it if you want to borrow.
Yeah. Well, yeah, or I could purchase it. And,
Yeah, right.
Is it?
There's two.
Is there two? Okay.
Yeah.
Is it available, published, like
Yes.
through Powell's? Okay.
Yeah.
Kurt Nelson being the husband of Sandy
Yeah.
Nelson, members of his community. That's a good reminder. That never popped up on my radar. Thank you. And he had even talked to me about his book. Huh. Anyways, brain doesn't always connect things together. Yeah. Okay. So that's the picture. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at Grand Ronde from essentially termination termination up through modern era, right? And we're going to talk about how that. We're going to look at the details of how that functioned and the ongoing effects. One of the things that Susan also brought up for me this week, which I haven't spoken to explicitly, is that in 2016, the ELCA released a statement basically apologizing for the Doctrine of Discovery. Are you familiar with that concept, Doctrine of Discovery? Does anybody know anything about that, Glenn? Yeah, or Jim, want to speak to that at all, or? Well, essentially, it actually not terminates. It actually realizes into an actual legal decision. So it goes all the way back to what's the name of the decision? Sorry, I pulled it up here. Johnson versus Mintosh of 1823, and essentially, it has to do with who gets land, right? And it's all about in support of settlers claiming territory and saying, this is my home, my whatever, against the native peoples that had lived in this place for time immemorial, right? And the important aspect of this is it isn't just a legal decision. It becomes the philosophical and even theological underpinnings for how we, especially Protestant peoples, justified ourselves in claiming this land, which is the land of native peoples, right? And it's interesting that it's essentially taken us, 300 years to speak to it? I mean, so 2016, if you go back, not 300 years, but 200 years.
But the papal bull.
The papal, yes,
It was in the
1500s, yep.
And that's what all of the explorers took with them, was we are coming to convert or kill.
Convert or kill, we are going to save souls for Jesus, regardless of the methods used.
So
And-
when they planted that flag and said, this is ours, it's both a legal
And a theological. So you're not only justified according to, in this case, United States law, according to the decision that dates back to the early 19th century, you're justified according to your faith as well, too. Which, if you think about it, is a really important thing. And I don't mean this in a positive light. It's a really important thing in order to, as a human being, justify your actions, right? Because human beings always want to be the good guy of their story. So you have to confront this issue, which is that, when you realize that there are native peoples who have been in this land for tens of thousands of years potentially, and you have come in, and I don't know that Christopher Columbus never necessarily lost a whole lot of sleep over this, or Francisco Balboa, or any of the early conquistadors, or, to be fair, even many of the later pioneers moving west. I don't know that people lost a lot of sleep because we as human beings are fantastic at being able to justify ourselves, right? And what we do, especially when we're confronted or critiqued according to our behavior, is we either face up to it and say, oh, okay, that was actually wrong, I shouldn't have done that, or we double down, right? And we as white Americans have a history of doubling down again and again. Jim?
Yeah, as I read about my Norwegian heritage and back in the 1800s, there's all these flyers coming out from the U.S. to Norway and the other Scandinavian countries say we have land. So they take the boat across, they take the tram to Wisconsin, Minnesota, they go out hiking to find
Yeah.
the trees they want, they hack a tree, hack the 4 trees on the corners,
Yeah.
and it's there.
Yep.
It's very heroic. I mean, you're reading the books. And then it does touch on all the Indian wars that resulted from that.
Yeah.
They were very tragic.
Yeah. Yeah. Tragic that the people had to complain about us taking their land.
Well, the background of Western movement, even in Europe, anywhere in Europe, was land taking.
Yeah.
That's what all the wars were all about.
Yeah.
So it was, you could say, in our blood.
Yeah, to be fair to us, that's basically how we've operated for time immemorial.
We're strong enough
Yeah.
to take the land.
Might makes right, and consequently, the church had to get on board with that too. I mean, divine, what's the divine right of kings? Yeah, is that essentially, church has to justify the fact that there's some rich dude that has wealth and power and food and comfort, and there's a bunch of poor people that are working and starving to death and dying of the Black Plague. Yeah, fascinating human history. But one thing I did want to mention too is that an important legal outcome of that decision in 1823 was how it had to do with how we thought about sovereignty and control of territory. So, basically, what the legal statement, the impact of the legal statement is that it essentially said that at the moment of discovery by a white settler, the tribes which had formerly occupied the land no longer had sovereignty and no longer had property rights over that area. So just think about the inherent racist nature of that, which is essentially you're saying that all these other people were holding the land in trust until we got there. Thanks for reserving our spot. And yeah, right. And it's even worse than that. Anyways. If you want to talk more about that, the other piece that I'm going to talk about today at some point is the 1988 Indian Gambling Act, which is something that I didn't really know a whole lot about how that came to be and the consequences of it. It is absolutely fascinating, and it is absolutely important to understanding where tribal relations and tribal sovereignty has ended up in 2021. Okay, so I do want to, this is going back a little bit, but I kind of glossed over some stuff, and I hate when I gloss over things. So I do want to go back and just highlight a couple of pieces that describe life leading up to the Termination Act. Because it's important to understand, because I kind of get hand-waved a lot of, there was conflict, right? Yeah, there was absolutely conflict, and a lot of it, almost all of it, was because of the way in which the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the white populace around, the Caucasian European populace around it did not stick to their word. There's a quote in here which I found really fascinating, talking about even the continuing effects of disease on the reservations, right? Because think about this. You take a populace of people who have already been ravaged by disease, you put them all in one place, right? And then you bring in people, right? Whether it's a Belgian priest or whether it's a new guard, for the militia that's keeping guard, making sure that none of the native people leave. That's coming into contact with these people, and guess what? They're bringing with them diseases. Okay, so the deaths due to disease do not stop after the 90% losses that occur leading into the 19th century, and this is a really interesting story. So one of the things that they would do every day to bring the kids to class is that on Grand Run Reservation, someone would blow a trumpet, right, announcing that the school day was about to begin and all the kids got there. during that time, there was a ton of flu going around, and people were dying from the flu. And the belief began to spread that it was the trumpet that was spreading the disease. So here's a quote, or here's an excerpt from the book. In fact, one shaman proclaimed that illness came from the trumpet blown by the teacher at the opening of the school, an act that spread disease over the camp like a mist. The teacher reported, "I was not such a monster as to sound it again, so Indians still live." So imagine the teacher receiving this information that the thought is out there that your trumpet is the patient zero, that you're spreading the plague. So he stopped blowing the trumpet every day. But I just wanted to bring up that disease doesn't stop being a problem. The other piece is we talk about the transition in languages, right? So I mentioned, in this book, you get a really fascinating perspective. So George Aguilar talks about when he started school, and he was in the Warm Springs Reservation. He was speaking one language. By the time he finished school, he was speaking 2.5 languages, okay? Because at that time there were 3, similar to Grand Ronde on Warm Springs, there were 3 major languages that had kind of risen up. And he spoke 2 of them pretty fluently, and the half language was he spoke some words in the other one. When he finished school, he spoke English and had forgotten the other 3, right? So the intentional transition of from native language to English was happening, and in fact, this resolves in 1887. The federal government actually passes a law prohibiting native speech in schools, right? So it wasn't just in practice, it was in enforcement as well, too. I forgot to mention the name of that Belgian priest was Father Adrian Croquet, which is an interesting name. So if you ever wanted to look up anything on him and see about that. And he founded St. Michael's Church on the property. What's fascinating, and again, it's helpful to put numbers to this some of the time, is that, so 10 years after he arrives, 650 of the 870 natives that were living on the Grand Ronde reservations were at least nominally Catholic, right? So relatively successful, preaching. Apparently, I don't know what his recipe for success was. Although one of the important pieces was that he intentionally let them continue their native practices, right? So, and this maybe has to do with why he was so warmly welcomed, was that despite as long as they showed up in church on Sunday, they were still holding all of their seasonal dances, the warm house dance, the ghost dance, all of these others. Those practices were still continuing in line with Catholicism, which isn't super surprising because Catholicism, despite its various malfunctions, has a rich history of syncretism, right? Of allowing native practices to continue. Because what we get nowadays, especially in terms of Central and South American Catholicism, very much incorporates prior native practices. When you look at something like Dia de los Muertos, that's a perfect example of a syncretism of All Saints Day or All Souls Day, All Saints Day and All Souls Day being combined with a prior Aztecan festival that kind of merges with some other stuff thrown in. It's not just Aztecan; it's bigger than that. And for example, voodoo is syncretism of Catholicism along with West African ancestor worship and some other things thrown in there as well too. So to be fair to Catholicism, they have historically been A-okay with that most of the time, with the exception of that period where the Spanish Inquisition was alive and well, and tried to root out a lot of that stuff. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Anyways, so the Christianity that evolves also, aside from Catholicism, in many reservations, and you may have heard it referred to before as the Indian Shaker religion. Have you heard of that? So it essentially becomes a bit of a more ecstatic, almost Pentecostal version of Christianity, but it's also kind of a syncretism of Christianity and native practices. So we're not going to spend a lot of time with that, but it's interesting to know about. And one of the key elements of that was that it was incorporating some of the existing shamanism into Christianity as well too. And shamans, of course, weren't just spiritual. They were healers. They were decision makers within the community. fascinating topic there. Okay, anyways, I wanted to highlight some of those pieces that I tend to do the grand narrative arcs and I miss out on the details. Also, two industries that end up coming out of the reservation experience this is such a Pacific Northwest thing, hop picking. So many Native peoples end up getting into the hop business, being day laborers or ongoing. They found great success in that. And then jam making was the other piece. So there was actually a specific Grand Ronde blackberry jam that became very famous for a long time. It was called gay moccasin, of course, in the ancient usage of being happy moccasin, not having anything to do with LGBTQ issues. But yeah, they made a killing selling blackberry jam, apparently. So just wanted to highlight that to show how they adapted with the circumstances that they were in. So let's talk about a little bit in depth Termination Act. I brought my nice potent espresso today. So in a lot of ways, the Termination Act is a culmination of efforts to dissolve the reservation, right? It's not like somebody flipped a switch, decided we're ending the reservations, passes a law, and that's it. This is more realistically the culmination of years of efforts to undermine and dissolve reservation properties. I mentioned a little bit last week, but particularly with regards to the Grand Ronde Reservation, the beginning of this, the significant beginning of this happens as far back as 1865, where, and I misquoted, it's a 30-mile wide strip that runs east from Yaquina Bay. You know where Yaquina Bay is? So you can imagine, starting at Yaquina Bay, going all the way east, is a 30-mile wide strip that is taken from the coastal reservation, and then immediately the Alsea Agency, which is the southern part, there are plans to eliminate that as well too. And it really was a divide and conquer, right? Like if we can cut through the coastal reservation and you split them into the Alseas and the Yaquinas, the real intent was actually to take the Alsea land, right? But in order to do that, they had to break it up in the first place. So that's happened as far back as 1865. It's also happening in Siletz and Grand Ronde lands as well too. By 1875, the Siletz and Grand Ronde reservations only had approximately 298,000 acres out of the original 1.4 million acres that initially made up the reservations. So this is only 1875. This is only 20 years, and in that course of 20 years, you have reduction of land by over 75%. And it wasn't any one thing, right? Some of it was federal action, some of it was private interests, either claiming or purchasing lands, even though it was technically illegal. And then kind of the final nail in the coffin, right, which really reduces land, and I don't know, you may have heard of this, is the Dawes Severalty Act. Is that on anybody's radar? So this is in 1887, and basically, I think I might have mentioned it way back, but the Dawes Severalty Act is kind of like this final effort to convert Indians from communal living to nuclear living, right, like white people do. And so what the Dawes Severalty Act does is it gifts each Indian household, again, household is not the big households that we were thinking of, households as defined by our thinking which husband, wife, children, they each get 160 acres of arable land, which is a lot, right? Like my family has about 100 acres of land in northeast Michigan, and I can explore that for days, right? There's a lot of territory there. But if you do the math and you realize that what they were doing was they were parceling out in 160 acre increments this huge, what at this point was only 298,000 acres, it doesn't take you long to realize that what they were doing was taking yet a larger chunk of the land. So what they did was they parceled out this 160 acres per person with the option for additional grazing land, which they would not own, but would be held in, held in trust. But the price of getting this land was that you then stop being native, you stop being Indian, governed by the treaty laws, and you become a full citizen of the United States of America. So there's a price attached to it, right? And guess what happens? Some people take it, a lot of people don't. And this essentially begins the big argument fight over what eventually becomes the Indian Termination Act, right? Because despite the fact that not a lot of Indians took the agreement to take that land, enough did, and enough do over the course of time, right? Because what you've got happening is a growing population, right? And we've already talked about people moving from the reservation to different places. So what it does successfully is it essentially detaches and further erodes tribal identity, right? Which was arguably the purpose at the beginning. Go ahead, Matt.
The way that law worked is that when the family got the land, it was still held in trust by the federal government.
Yep.
But after 25 years, the family petitioned the government to lift that trust down.
Yep.
So that it became the same as any other private land which they could then sell, and almost always did eventually.
But I think they had to purchase it, didn't they? They had to purchase it from the government after 25 years?
Sure, but the problem with it is that it took it out of any kind of federal
Management.
oversight.
Yep.
And took it away from being Indian land or individual Indian
Yep.
land, becoming the same as any other private land. So you go to some of these reservations, like up in Montana, where they have a lot of this, you'll have the reservation boundary, but within the reservation, there are all these private inholdings that have been private only for 100 years or more, because of that act. So it just,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
the tribes kind of on the outside looking in at the whole thing.
well, and to put a number to it, specifically for the Grand Ronde Reservation, I mean, not a lot of people end up taking it, but 30,000 acres ends up leaving reservation status due to this, with an additional 26 that are in the extra grazing land. Beth, and then
Jay's dad
Yeah.
was a tribal member because of his birthday. He owned land on the Yakima Reservation, that's exactly that. He chose never to claim the land that remained within the reservation, but his grandmother platted both down to Totnish. Her property was Totnish, and that's what she ended up establishing business. But that's exactly,
yeah,
it's the history pretty much, and it's who decided to stay, who decided to leave their lands. His lands, took him 10 years after his death, he ceded the land back to the tribe,
Huh.
and 10 years after his death, because of. his
Wow.
ownership.
yeah. Well, and to add on to the number, I just quoted too. So approximately 30,000 lands leave via these 160 acre
And then you
allotments.
can see it in families, like.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I mean, it's-
Yeah. But
And
the-
it was just an accident birth, like when they did that parceling thing, it was a certain date, like Jerry was born in '08 and he got his 160 acres or whatever. His sister
Whatever it was, yeah.
born 10 years later did not.
Yeah.
Because it was some weird thing.
Well,
about the date.
it's right here. So minors, not minors, minors, were to receive per capita payments in compensation for the land, but no payments were ever made. Which is, this is a famous trick that we've played over and over again. And additionally, so I mentioned, you've got a 160 acre allotment with grazing land that was promised as well too. So there was like 30,000 acres that came out with allotments. There's an additional 26 that were converted to grazing land. But guess what happens to those 26,000 acres? They end up being sold off by the government to private interests, right? So this was, you can see the grand scheme behind things, right? Was that, however many Indians there were going to get the 160 acre allotments, and then they were just going to sell everything else off, right? But of course, most people didn't take the allotment at that time, which threw a wrench in things. So it was kind of considered, the Dawes Act was kind of considered a failure until the Termination Act comes along. And, okay, Gail.
I was just gonna say that 160 acres in many places wasn't worth anything because of
No.
where it was, like in northern
Yep.
Montana. You couldn't live on 160 acres.
Nope.
And do anything with it in some of those areas.
Yep.
And I'm sure that's why Jerry's family.
Yeah.
went there.
And it was up to the,
A whole lot more grazing land than that, if you were gonna do anything with it in terms of cattle or anything like that, or raise crops.
yeah. And it was up to the BIA, because it was by the letter of the law, it was supposed to be arable land, but it was up to the BIA to determine what arable land was. And for example, these extra 26,000 acres were supposed to be grazing land, but guess who they all got sold off to? Timber interests, So what kind of grazing land was this? It was forested. There was no grazing land. So again, you pull back the curtain, you kind of see the motivations that underlie it. So Dawes Severalty Act arguably doesn't work, kind of does work. And then the next 50 years are busy, right? Because you have World War I, and then eventually World War II, and so you don't get a lot of movement with regards to reservation stuff. Although it's still happening. These wars of attrition of private interests and all that are still happening. But it's after World War II then that we get what we end up referring to as the Termination Act. And here was the philosophy behind it, is that Congress's new policy with regards to native tribes was essentially they wanted to terminate any reservation whose tribes were considered by Congress to be capable of managing their own affairs and ready to assimilate into mainstream culture, right? So it's pretty upfront here what the idea was, is that these lands were desirable and necessary. There were natural resources in these lands that were needed to power the industrial complex of the post-war American economy, and they wanted Indians to live like everybody else, right? Which, if they wanted 160 acres of land, no problem. Just give us access to the other 300,000 or whatever is in there. So just keep in mind that is the underlying philosophy that feeds into the Termination Act. And an important thing to recognize here is that this is, when we talk about description versus prescription, right? There is no descriptive here. In other words, there is no reason to believe that any of the tribes were wanting to or were capable of doing this assimilation, right? This was purely prescriptive. In other words, the United States government, Congress, had decided that this was going to happen, and so they made up the narrative that these tribes were ready to do it, right? And so the process that follows is similar somewhat, that's a false comparison, I shouldn't say that, but in some ways similar to what happens with the Dawes Severalty Act, in which they are trying to move Native peoples, again, into owning land, being part of mainstream society, functioning like any other normal person. And the way that functions varies depending on which reservation you're talking about, because not all reservations went through this, right? So we talk about the Western Oregon Termination Act, right? That's a specific individual law that went into place. And each area of the United States had similar stuff happen, but not all areas of the United States went through this. So it wasn't like all reservations were wiped out across the U.S. It happened in specific locations, okay, which is why we probably didn't hear about it so much. And of course, I don't mean to belabor this point, but of course the real issue here was timber interests, natural resources, and stuff like that. And here is kind of, again, pulling back the curtain. So the main tribes that were terminated in Oregon were all those west of the Cascades, as well as the Klamath tribes. Okay, so Grand Ronde, Siletz, Coastal, the ones down southern Oregon, which I don't go down there that often, and then if you draw, it's almost like an L, and then you draw east to the Klamath reservations. Those were all terminated by the Western Oregon Termination Act. However, the amount of land that existed as reservation was not significant by that point in time. In some ways, it was more of a formality than it was actual act. But the formality is important. Okay, so and notice too that all the tribes who were terminated were ones that had considerable timber holdings. Right. This was there was thought that went behind this. Okay, so 1954 is the Western Oregon termination. An important piece of this, and this is what distinguishes it, for example, from something like the Dawes Severalty Act, is that when the Termination Act is passed, there are no provisions for hunting or fishing rights. So in other words, when they are removed from the land that they had been inhabiting, there is no provision made for them to continue the practices of subsistence that they had been doing, or, and this is the important piece, a la the Willamette Falls point, or to go to their sacred sites anymore, right? This land was removed from their use and from their access. And that's a really important distinction here as well too, because this is 100% about turning Native peoples into white Caucasians, taking away their culture, taking away their language, taking away their cultural access. Okay. So after all is said and done, out of the original 1.4 million acres that initially made up the Grand Ronde, Siletz, and coastal reservations, are only 597 acres left. Okay. So, I mean, this is less than a percentage that is left post-Termination Act. However, 800 allotments are still held in trust, which we'll talk about. So, 1956, the reservations are officially closed, and a trustee is appointed to dispose of the remaining land, most of which is sold by 1961, so just 5 years. Matt, to answer your question from a week ago, it is indeed the states who gain control of that land. The land is taken out of federal trust, it's given into the hand of the states, and it's up to the states to do with it whatever they want to do with it. So our suspicions were right, but I wanted to look that up specifically. And then finally, even though all of this land gets sold off, in the next 30 years or so, the actual concept of ownership never actually gets resolved, which also kind of points out that this was something that was decided, hadn't really been thought through all that well. They were really interested in selling the land off and getting the money from it. But even though the land was technically given to the states, there were continuing legal battles over state, county, federal jurisdiction on these properties that were supposedly now given into possession of the state. And then one of the highlight things is that through this entire process, there are still Grand Ronde Indians who never had a ratified treaty, okay? Which is to say that these are people where if we go back 100 years now, right, never signed a document relinquishing control or right of their land, right? They may have even signed a document, but it was never actually ratified by an act of Congress. So there is no legal ground to stand upon for the taking of this land. But again, might makes right, as we've already talked about. And, okay, one piece to point out here is we didn't, not being fair, we didn't totally leave them on their own. So there were job training programs that were set up. There were housing arrangements that were made. There was an attempt made to help smooth this transition process. But of course, almost none of the tribal members took any of this, right? Why would they want to? Why would we want to take the handout now that you charged us for a moment ago? I mean, so there was this huge break in, no kidding, breach in trust that existed. And so this is the Mal feelings that continues through to today, is that was just, I mean, you talk about all the stuff that happened. This was the piece that really, broke the spirit of congeniality, or I don't even know how to describe it. Okay, I don't know that we're going to get all through with this today. Any questions thus far, Matt?
In today's Grand Ronde tribe, what are the qualifications for somebody being a Grand Ronde member?
It's
Is it by bloodline or something?
yes. The thing I don't know is if it's percentage based.
Things change, so yes and no. At least my understanding for my kids is now we have to live on a reservation. Like my husband's father was a tribal member because of percentage of blood, because of blood. But now you also have to have, there's got to be some time to the reservation to be on. Like my kids can't suddenly decide they want to be Yakima. It's not, there's both and conditions, I believe.
I think it's a little more complex than that.
Yeah, and that's when it's not.
And it may vary tribe by tribe, reservation by reservation, but at least in how I've been reading with regards to Grand Ronde, is that because of the nature of how much of the Grand Ronde tribal affiliation lives outside the reservation, that their definition is less because not many folks actually live on a reservation in terms of Grand Ronde. But that's for Grand Ronde specifically. I don't know how it is for Yakima or other places. Yeah, Jim.
You know, our grandchildren have a certain percent blood
Yeah,
and Grand Ronde.
Yeah.
And they are the last ones as far as percent. Their children will have
they'll fall below the threshold.
enough percent.
Yeah.
They have enough percent to qualify for certain loans for education.
Yeah.
So they,
But this is a good question, Matt, because this is currently, you know, like Beth is talking about, this is currently one of the big things at debate amongst many Native peoples. And specifically, especially with regard to the Grand Ronde, and it has to do with why the Grand Ronde educational trusts exist. It's why they're really emphasizing teaching language, teaching culture, all this, is because the writing on the wall is that in another generation, you're going to have yet more and more people that are falling below that threshold of blood. And so in a strong regard, there's really kind of this redefinition that's happening where what does it mean to be a tribal member of Grand Ronde? You know, does it mean that I or my children have a certain percentage of blood? Or does it mean that I am participating in the cultural aspects of the community, right? To answer these questions, we almost need to have a Grand Ronde member in here to talk about how that works. I suspect, just from some of my reading, that what is happening now is that they're maybe defining different categories of membership, seems to be. But I can't say that for certain. You know, in other words, you participate in the Grand Ronde tribe, but you might not be a voting member, right? Kind of similar to how church works. But that part of that is just conjecture on my part. I don't know that for sure, and it's based on readings. There isn't. Well, I'm not going to make a statement that I can't back up.
Jesse, one of the problems all that sets up is that, you know, when I worked for the government, we would deal with various tribes on different things, you know. And one of the tribes I dealt with was the Norwegian Heritage in Montana. And we'd go to these meetings, and they would spend more time arguing among themselves about who was really representing the tribe. And they had elections and stuff.
Yeah.
But within the tribal community, and I could never really penetrate this at all, but they would be talking about each other as if some had more cred than others.
Absolutely.
So I'd be just sitting there, you know, watching this go back and forth, thinking to myself, man, how are we ever going to get a consensus about something like this at all? We're talking about policing off the reservation, right? And trying to get a group of people to sort of come up with a plan for themselves how they're going to deal with it.
But again, how like church is this, right? like, well, I've been my parents were members, my parents' parents were members, and you've only been here for 2 years. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know the history of the building. You know. Yeah, it's a real crisis. I mean, it's a real crisis in a lot of ways, and I suspect. Again, my lens has been Grand Ronde, but I suspect that a lot of different tribes and reservations are handling it differently. But regardless, there's going to be it's going to be a thing that they all need to walk through in terms of how they define themselves as tribe, you know. And it's going to have legal ramifications as well too, you know. I mean, it's not just about identity at that point. Can you stick around for another 10 minutes or so? Is that okay? Okay. So let's begin to talk restoration, because this is the important part. So restoration happens officially in the mid-'80s, right? I think it's like 86, 88 for a Grand Ronde reservation. But restoration actually starts the day after the Termination Act passes. So here's the data point that I think is so beautiful. So after all is said and done, there's 2.5 acres left that are nominally tribal ground, specifically because it's the tribal cemetery. Okay. So that was the one piece we weren't going to force them to move their dead bodies. No. There was one building that exists in the tribal cemetery, which is a tool shed, and it's from that tool shed then that the tribal headquarters is established, and they begin issuing a newsletter from the Grand Ronde Reservation, the remaining 2.5 acres in the tribal cemetery. So then what happens, and I had mentioned this briefly last week, is that they end up reorganizing under a state corporation charter, okay, which I don't know a whole lot about. But, to make a long story short, they end up creating a new thing, which is now the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes, as a way of maintaining, bridging, we know it's bridging now, but a way of maintaining the remnant of a remnant of a remnant of what that reservation formerly was. But the important piece is that organizing under a state charter gives them access to state and federal assistance. So it gives them a chance at funding, okay? What's interesting is that at this point, and again, it's exactly what you're talking about, Matt, not everyone is actually in favor of restoration. In fact, many of the tribal members are just like, I'm done. I'm not fighting this fight anymore. Let us go be who we are. But a remnant of a remnant remains and carries the cultural tradition on. And this is really compressing a lot of time, but over the next 30 years or so, from that 2.5 acre cemetery with the tool shed on it, which I imagine the buildings expanded somewhat over that time period, they continue with legal battles. They continue and it's not just legal battles, it is rebuilding a tribal identity from this site. I mean, this is the importance of these newsletters, right? It's that they're mailing these newsletters out to anybody that will receive them, trying to maintain a connection with the people who formerly identified with this tribe. And it's miraculously successful, right? So over the course of 30 years, and it basically goes all the way up to November 22nd, 1983, which is when the official restoration begins, okay? Here is the not so heartening statistic. And again, this points out the fallacy of this idea of, well, we're doing this because they're basically ready to incorporate into our society. Is over those 30 years, Grand Ronde members had incomes averaging 1/3 of other Oregonians. Okay, so these are people who are working full-time, are earning 1/3 of what most Oregonians are making. 68% were below below the poverty line, right? Unemployment was 3 times the state average. And as we are aware of, you have issues of substance abuse, alcoholism, mental illness, all these things that essentially went untreated because these are people who kind of inhabit this gap space in our society now, who in most cases don't have access to medical health care and any of the things that are necessary, especially having experienced the trauma that they experienced. So those 30 years were not good, right, to really reduce things down, okay? So when restoration happens, it's not about land, right? It is about land, it's also not about land. It is about providing access to these folks again. It's about providing identity, like we talked about in the sermon today, to these folks again who had that identity taken away from them. So 83, November 22nd, 83 is when the restoration commences. And then it's finally March 14th, 1988, that they are restored 9,811 acres to reform as the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes. And it was Bureau of Land Management, Timberland, and Yamhill County. That is the modern site of Grand Ronde. The things that helped and continue to help were, because it was timberland, this is timberland that can be leveraged as a resource for the community, right? So they did, absolutely. They harvested timber from that as a way of bringing income into the tribe. The other piece, and this is what I'll close with today, is passing of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. Coincidentally, also 1988. Okay, so as a way of foreshadowing for next week, what we'll do then is I'll look at a lot of this stuff that I promised to look at today, which is what does it look like today? What are the cultural things that are going on? What does it look like in the modern era? Okay, but I want to talk about the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act because this changed the playing field for tribes across the United States. Does anybody know anything about this? Any of the history? I have a small glimpse into it, in that my mom's best friend in college ends up becoming a lawyer and I should remember which tribe it was, in Minnesota. She herself is of significant native blood. Lenore ends up becoming she's a lawyer specifically with regards to gaming rights for tribes. So I'm going to pick her brain at some point. I haven't talked to her since my mom died, so I'm going to reach out to Lenore again and find out about what her perspective on this is.
The one thing that I pick up, especially in Minnesota, because of my kids being there,
Mm-hmm.
and Jim's family being there for a long time, there's a lot of bitterness about that.
Yeah, there is.
Bitterness.
Yeah.
And they don't pay taxes and all this, you know.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Yeah. Definitely a mixed bag.
yeah.
Both with regards to American society and with regards to Native society, because it's not necessarily a 100% good thing, right? Because gambling brings with it other vices, other issues, right?
But guess where all the people go?
Yeah, I know, right? Right? We all go, right? I hear, you all tell me I'm going to Spirit Mountain or I'm going to, I should know that.
The joke is they're finally getting stronger like that.
Yeah, by taking it from you all. Okay, so here, really quickly, this is how it happens. 88 is when the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is passed under President Ronald Reagan. But the actual process of establishing Indian gaming rights happens way back in the 60s and 70s. And there's a couple of specific cases. Mainly it's the Seminole tribe in Florida who kind of pushes the boundaries on this. But it actually starts with a property tax disagreement in Minnesota. Of course, everything starts in Minnesota, where there was a Native family living on Native land that received a bill, an astronomical bill for property taxes. Okay, who knows which editing, accounting, or administrative error caused this to happen? But it goes to court, right? They're not paying property taxes. This is sovereign Native land held in trust by the United States federal government for tribes. We don't owe you anything. But one of the fallouts of this is, and of course the property tax gets dismissed, is that it defines in legal standing the case that they don't pay taxes at all and that there is no regulation over what they can do on their land, right? All of the gambling laws that we've passed because of the mafia and Las Vegas and all this stuff, none of it holds true. So there is no, as yet, Kathy, what's the word for a law that stands...
What's the word for what? I don't know.
Sorry, that is not a very precedent. There is not as yet any specific legal precedent establishing the gaming rights. That doesn't happen until 1988. But there's no legal precedent not establishing gaming rights. So what happens is they begin testing the boundaries. For example, the Seminole tribe in Florida begins doing bingo nights 7 days a week, where state law establishes that you can only have it 2 nights a week. And this was to appease the Catholics, right? No limits, bingo is where it all starts from. And what happens then is that the state takes the Seminole tribe to court saying you can't do this, and then the court says, no, they absolutely can. There is no regulation. This is a sovereign tribe on their land. You can't tax them. You can't regulate what they do on their land. And so this ticks off the state, of course, right? Begins happening all over the country and other places. So California, North Dakota, I think there was another circumstance. This all culminates finally in 1988. So this is typical to so many things that happen in this story, is that it's bittersweet. Because what happens in 1988 with the passing of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is that now there is officially a legal statement saying you are allowed to build casinos on tribal land. You're allowed to do this. No longer are people going to be harassed by state police officers at the reservation line. We're done with that. But it's now taxable. So states, and I have to do a little bit more research to understand the mechanism. But now states essentially get a special tax on gaming revenue, right? Which was essentially the agreement that was made. This was the compromise that was made. Despite the fact that technically the US of A didn't have a leg to stand on, right? Except that the Indians knew that if they didn't have something like this passed, the conflict was gonna escalate. In other words, states were gonna continue to cause problems. They weren't gonna, pave the highways that lead to the reservations so that they could build these casinos. So this was the compromise that was made, is that states now get a cut of the money. In return, they can do it. That is the beginning. Now here's this number that I absolutely love. after the Indian Regulatory Act is passed, gaming revenue in 1 year goes from 1.7 million to 17.8 billion. Or it might have been 5 years. But like this is the significance. Now talk about, I mean, and again, this is a complicated thing, right? There is plenty of bad blood on both sides. There's plenty of frustration with all the things that gambling brings in. And we're biased to a certain extent as Americans because of our organized crime experiences and stuff like this. But you can't argue with the fact that all of a sudden, so this is right in the middle of and during the beginning of Restoration, all of a sudden tribes who had nothing before have an opportunity to fund the social services that their tribe so badly needs. So for the Grand Ronde specifically, and we'll look more in depth at this next week, for the Grand Ronde, this means healthcare. This means housing, specifically senior housing, right? Because if you think seniors have a bad normal, imagine being a family that has no generational wealth at all, right? Who historically cared for their elders by having them stay in, live in the same house with them. Senior housing is extremely, extremely important to the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. So it allows them to build senior housing. It allows them to provide education for tribal members. It allows them to do cultural education for the tribe as a whole. I mean, this is a huge boon, despite all the complications that goes along with it. But anyways, yeah.
Maybe next week, or besides the gambling law, are there a lot of other laws, federal and state, that don't apply on reservation?
That's a really complicated topic because the answer is yes, D, all of the above, asterisk. Yeah.
It's not a yes or no answer.
This is where my mom's friend Lenore would be perfect to talk to because I bet you she knows every exemption, every exception that there is about it. Yeah.
Can Indians vote if you belong?
They can serve in the U.S. Armed Forces.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. When did that?
And have done. There was never any demarcation for that. So you have Native peoples serving in World War I, right? And if you go to the Grand Ronde Reservation, there is a veterans memorial there for both World War I, World War II, and Vietnam veterans. Yeah, and Korean. I mean, for all the foreign wars. Yeah. So, I mean, there's another irony, tragedy is that you've got Native peoples dying for a country that they don't technically belong to.
Do they have citizenship now?
Yeah.
Good.
They have voting rights.
I never got that part.
Yeah. Last piece of tidbit of information, and then I'll let you go. Just to kind of show, and again, I'm kind of fanboying on the Grand Rondes a little bit, just because I'm so impressed with them. But they in turn have given from their boon as well too. So in 2003, the Spirit Mountain Casino and Resort created the Spirit Mountain Community Fund, which amounted to about $300,000 for the Wilhelmina and Sheridan school districts, which are not tribal reservation members, right? So they acknowledge that many of the people who work at the casino are not tribal members. They're people that live in the area. And so they saw it as their duty and their responsibility to care for the children of these people, hence creating this sizable fund to help improve the system of their school district and whatnot. So cool stuff. All right, folks. Thank you. Thank you.